Wow, Julie, thank you so much. This is a subject that is so at home to my life and pure existence. I started out in Alaska as full time in the commercial business as a captain, and that was in 1986 in Glacier Bay National Park. I was hired by the Park Service to run their boat, and that particular year they didn't have any crew housing, so I was able to bring my family up, which was at that time an infant son, a pregnant wife, and we lived on our sailboat about 100 feet off the Park Service's headquarters pier for the entire season. And that was an experience like none that you can imagine. I think I'm one of the first, if not the only, person that got a permit to live on a sailboat inside the bay all season long, way back when. And even my son's first words as he approached that 12-month area or so, 14 months, was on the deck of our sailboat in Bartlett Cove in Glacier Bay National Park. And it wasn't mom or dad, it was, because that was the sound of the humpback whales that surrounded our little sailboat, a little 40-foot sailboat. As I went off to work and ran the boat during the day and came home at night, he was listening to whales all the time. So that's Glacier Bay is a special place for me for many reasons. Living in Juneau, it's where I take my own time to kayak and vacation. And as you'll learn during this presentation, Glacier Bay is richer to uncruise adventures than probably just about any company out there, because we actually put feet on the ground in Glacier Bay. And you'll learn this from Ben, but out of the million or so people that visit Glacier Bay every year, most of which are by large foreign cruise ship, only 1% of the entire number actually put feet on the ground in Glacier Bay National Park. And out of that 1%, that is, well, I should say, that 1% is primarily made up of Uncruise Adventures guests, which all have the opportunity to put feet on the ground in the wilderness, not just at the headquarters, but in the wilderness area of Glacier Bay National Park. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ben. And Ben is a guy who's been working with me for a number of years now. Happy to say that, Ben came on as a guest with his family years ago, which means a lot to me. But before I bring Ben on, I just want to share you that little Uncruise, privately owned business, American business, pay all the taxes, the employment taxes that the big boys don't have to worry about. We're setting history. For the first time in my knowledge, a single cruise brand, Uncruise Adventures, has received 4 Best in Alaska awards in one season, which is the 2024 season. I've never seen this before, and we're actually vying for a 5th coming up here shortly. So I think it's good reason for those of you who may not know Uncruise to realize that there's this little small US company that works right out of Juneau, Sitka, Whittier, Dutch Harbor, Sitka, etc., Ketchikan, where you can hop on a boat, have an adventure expedition of your lifetime, and not waste 2 or 3 days at sea getting to Alaska. It's all 100% in Alaska. So please celebrate with us these wonderful awards. And Ben, I'm going to ask you to take it over and give the intimate knowledge of Alaska that you and I both share and love.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'm really excited to share with you all a little bit about Glacier Bay National Park today. It is a place that is near and dear to my heart. Every vessel that I have sailed on, I've specifically wanted to be on boats that travel into Glacier Bay National Park because of the astounding amount of beauty and history and resources and wildlife and just so much that it encapsulates. And so I'm going to share a little bit with you today about Glacier Bay National Park, why it's an incredible place to visit, why do we go there, why do we explore there, what is the history of the park, what are the glaciers doing in the park. I'm going to try and just give you a quick recap of what this whole place is about and why we love it so much. And yeah, if you thanks for the intro, Dan. If you haven't been on one of our webinars for this series or before, my name is Ben Marolf. I'm an expedition leader with Uncruise. I've been working for the company for the last 7 years, and I did first come up to Alaska in 2014 on the good old Wilderness Adventure as a guest, and it really captured me, captured my mind, my heart, my soul, and I had to figure out a way to get back, and so I did. I took jobs specifically to fulfill the requirements of a guide on board, and was a guide for a few years, and then started as an EL quite a few years back now, on the Wilderness Discoverer, and then on the Safari Endeavor. And so a little bit of background about me, just so you know, I'm not just some guy talking. I have degrees in biology and environmental studies, as well as environmental education. I have a keen interest in not only the place itself, but also on sort of minute things. I love behavioral psychology. If you didn't get the chance to watch that webinar, it doesn't focus on human behavioral psychology, but it focuses on what's going on in the brains and minds of the animals that we see in Southeast Alaska. We've got that uploaded on our YouTube if you're interested in watching it. And I just have a real passion for Alaska and for sharing Alaska with the people who come up to go on a trip with us. And we're going to focus really specifically today on Glacier Bay National Park. As we are going through this presentation, if you have any questions for me about things that I'm talking about, or just questions in general, you can throw those in the chat. Jimmy, thank you so much for monitoring that. I will try to get to those at the end of the presentation if I can. So let's talk about Glacier Bay National Park. In terms of scale, Glacier Bay is pretty enormous. This map that you're seeing in the bottom right corner of the screen is a map of what we consider Southeast Alaska. It's sort of the area that starts down near Ketchikan at the border between the United States and Canada, and it follows the coastline, connecting dots through the coastal range, through visible high point peaks is how Southeast Alaska was created, along the kind of eastern northeastern border, and then makes its way up through Glacier Bay, and then further on into Kenai, the Kenai Peninsula and the Fjords National Park up there. But on this map, the red outlined area is Glacier Bay National Park. And it's an enormous park. It's a park that is about the same size as the state of Connecticut. And it's just a little slice of Alaska, which gives you some perspective as to how huge Alaska is as a state. It's 3.3 million acres of protected land. It was set aside back in 1925 by President Calvin Coolidge as a national monument. It was made into a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979. The whole place was formed geologically during the Little Ice Age, which happened between 1550 and 1850. It was impacted by the Pleistocene Ice Age, which is like the major ice age that we think about when we think about the Ice Age. That was 20,000 years ago. But the Little Ice Age took place between 1550 and 1850, with maximums around then, and was really the driving force to carve out the park. And I'll get into the geology of this place and the glaciology of this place a little bit more. But what's something important to think about is that Glacier Bay is the ancestral homeland of the Huna Tlingit, the peoples who are still co-managing the park, and we'll talk more about that later as well. And it is the second largest marine protected area on planet Earth, after the Great Barrier Reef over in Australia. So it's a place with a lot of accolades and a lot of reasons to come see it and visit it and enjoy it. And I'm excited to share it with you all throughout the rest of this presentation. So let's go way back. I know this is a lot of text. I'm not going to cover all of it. But Glacier Bay is a really remarkable place. When we talk about Alaska from a geologic perspective, geologists often describe Southeast Alaska, in particular places in Glacier Bay, as what we call a terrain, or a geologic terrain wreck, because there's a lot of different forces and factors of rock moving up and upwelling and continental plates colliding. Glacier Bay and Southeast Alaska in general is on the Pacific Ring of Fire. So there's a ton going on in the park, and it is a really active place geologically. But the park itself, the deep fjords of Glacier Bay National Park, were carved out in stages, essentially. Around 4,000 years ago, the whole place was covered in a gigantic ice sheet called the Cordilleran Ice Sheet. And as things warmed up and things started to move around, the glaciers, which are doing all of the work, essentially, started moving back and forth through the park, carving out these really deep valleys that eventually filled with seawater as temperatures rised. Now, after those glaciers kind of pumped through and moved through the park and carved out these deep fjords. Then something started to take place, which is still occurring today, and it's called isostatic rebound, or post-glacial rebound. So there was so much ice sitting in the park that it actually pushed down on the crust of the earth and kind of submerged it, is a good way of putting it. And as that weight of the ice has backed off or left, through melting and just through natural effect and changes as things shift in the park, the profound weight of that lack and loss of ice has allowed the land to kind of rise back up and the crust to sort of make its way back to its normal shape. And so the land in Glacier Bay National Park is rising out of the water in some places at 1 to 2 inches per year. So in my relatively short lifetime so far, the land in Glacier Bay has emerged 4 to 6 feet in some locations, which is pretty crazy. And as that shifts, any sort of land shifting that fast, even though it feels slow, 1 to 2 inches per year, causes a lot of changes. And so Glacier Bay is a research haven for what do you get when you have a place that is sort of blank and new, and how do you transition that to a really diverse, healthy, old growth forest, which is what we see in the park and what we get to experience as we make our way up and down the main arm of Glacier Bay National Park on any trip that we take into the park. And today, what we're seeing is different moraines forming. So as the glaciers have reached their maximum and are retreating, we're seeing land pop up in places that hasn't been. Every single year that I visit Glacier Bay National Park, it is a different place. It is wild to see. The first time I visited, there was glaciers in some places and now there isn't, or there was glaciers that were further back and now slightly moved forward. It's just a wild, diverse, rapidly changing place. And so from a geologic perspective, from a glaciologic perspective, it is just a really fascinating place to get to visit, because you get to see land, you get to see a place shift, really in front of your eyes. If you get to go year after year, or even on a single day, you get to see, a massive calving event. You get to see, this profound change occur right in front of your eyes. So it's really a special place from a geologic perspective. It is the home of some of our most iconic species in Southeast Alaska. It is a humpback whale marine protected sanctuary. So it is one of very few places in Southeast Alaska that we as a company, we do not whale watch at all in Glacier Bay National Park, for humpback whales, at least. If we see orca, we can go hang out with them. But humpback whales are highly protected because it is such a productive place for them to come and find food. Outside of humpback whales, Glacier Bay is home to the coastal brown bear, a really iconic species in Southeast Alaska. There are black bears as well in Glacier Bay, since we're not on the island system of the Alexander Archipelago. Since Glacier Bay is mostly mainland, both brown and black bears are in the park. It's one of the few places that we get to see mountain goats at a really unique spot called Gloomy Knob, which is this section of Paleozoic limestone that has really steep relief and sharp cliffs, which is the area that the goats do best, so they can avoid some of their predators, the brown bear and also the wolf. Glacier Bay has a really well-studied wolf population that I'll talk more about a little bit later, but it's just home to some really incredible things. There's sea otters, there's stellar sea lions, there's every species of Pacific salmon that you could imagine has found a home in Glacier Bay National Park, as well as some of the most iconic flora of Southeast Alaska: the Sitka spruce, the western hemlock, the wonderful ginseng species, the Devil's Club, which has a ton of really deep ties to the indigenous peoples in Southeast Alaska. We see willow populations in Glacier Bay that we don't see other places because of first kind of run of succession after glaciers leave. Lots of bunchberry, Alaskan blueberry. It's just an amazing place from a flora fauna perspective. We see both tufted and horned puffins in the park at a place called South Marble Island that we visit on every single trip that we take into Glacier Bay. So it's just a great place not only to see glaciers and to see glaciation and to talk about the history and what's going on from a climate perspective, but it's also an amazing place to see wildlife. And it's just a really special day, or 2 days, when we get to go into Glacier Bay. So let's talk about what a glacier is. For me, the way I like to describe it to folks when they're coming on trips with me is that glaciers are essentially giant, slow-moving rivers. they follow the same physics as a river does because they are indeed made of water, and they follow the same principles of gravity moving downhill as a river would. And so it all starts up in the ice fields, and there's multiple ice fields in Glacier Bay National Park. Ice fields are these kind of lakes of ice, is what I like to describe them as. And as snow falls in a place, if it is cold enough or enough snow falls in that during the winter that it does not all melt during the summer, there is compaction that takes place. If you live in a place where you have to shovel your driveway, I grew up in Minnesota, and so I'm intimately familiar with this. You know that snow is heavy. And so not Glacier Bay doesn't just get a little bit of snow per year. We get, 10, 20, 30 feet if you're way up high, up to hundreds of feet, really, if you're way up high in the mountains. And all of the snow that falls, if it doesn't all melt during the summer, eventually begins to compact on top of itself. And so the snow gets pushed and squeezed by more snow as it falls. And that snow then eventually turns into ice. And the ice will fill these ice fields. And once it gets to a certain point, like an overflow, essentially, like there's too much ice in the ice field, it starts sending more ice downhill in the form of glaciers. And as those glaciers push downhill, since they are following gravity essentially as they move their way downhill, they do a lot of carving of these valleys that we get to go explore in Glacier Bay National Park. And it's not the actual ice that's doing the work. It's the rocks on the side that it picks up. So as the glacier moves downhill, there's just a ton of weight to a glacier, and so it grabs pieces of rock as it pushes its way downhill, and it actually uses that rock to carve out other rocks, which then carve out the valley and deposits those rocks at the base or the end or the terminal end of the glacier into what we call moraines. So that's the basics of what a glacier is and how they form. There are two different kinds, really, of glaciers that we see in Glacier Bay National Park. We've got valley glaciers, which are glaciers that form in mountain valleys and then flow downhill. One that we go see every single week is Marjorie, as well as Grand Pacific Glacier. Grand Pacific Glacier is the glacier that did the majority of the work of carving out the western arm or the main arm of Glacier Bay National Park. And then we also get to go explore tidewater glaciers. Marjorie is also a tidewater glacier, but we've got some really iconic ones that we get to go see. Johns Hopkins Glacier, the only glacier in Glacier Bay National Park that's advancing, as well as the Muir Glacier, which we don't go visit because it's in a protected area that's non-motorized up in the east arm of the park, but it's a very famous glacier, and I would be remiss if I didn't include talking about the Muir Glacier. It's just a crazy place to get to see these wild, huge chunks of ice. And when Muir came up to study in Glacier Bay, he had the difficult task of letting people know in writing what a glacier was. And for folks who were down, in the lower 48, you can imagine how difficult it was for him to, give someone an image in words of what a glacier is. Because what you're looking at when you're up there in Glacier Bay National Park is this wall of ice that's, 300 feet tall, sometimes 400 feet tall. That's just this blue ice. You don't see blue ice outside of looking at glaciers. And it's a pretty magical thing to get to see. And they are incredibly important, not only historically, but also today. Glacier Bay is home to over 1,000 glaciers, not all of which are named, but there are over 1,000 glaciers in Glacier Bay National Park. And today they are really changing. Over the last 100 years, many of the glaciers in Glacier Bay National Park have gone back a ton. And this is something that, again, I have just gotten to see, even in a short amount of time up in Southeast Alaska. You can imagine 100 years ago or 200 years ago what this place looked like because of how rapidly some of the retreats have been. And it's why I think it's important to share Glacier Bay with people, today, like this year, because you are seeing things that in 10 years, in 15 years, we can't guarantee are going to be there anymore. And it's profoundly important for folks to understand how vital not only the glaciers of Glacier Bay are, but just glaciers in general are to the planet and the climate. And it's a place that you gotta kind of go see as soon as you can, because it's gonna be different. It's gonna be wildly different in 10 years and 20 years. And so the glaciers of the park are iconic and important. The park itself has a really storied history. with the local peoples of Glacier Bay, the indigenous peoples of Glacier Bay, which are the Tlingit. And the Huna Tlingit have deep, deep ties to Glacier Bay National Park. They are pretty much the foremost experts, let's say, about Glacier Bay. They're the historical inhabitants of the park. They have inhabited, pardon me, the Glacier Bay region for thousands of years. They have a deep and enduring connection to the land, the waters, and the resources of the area. There's rich cultural traditions and oral histories that are closely tied to the natural environment of Glacier Bay. These traditions include storytelling, ceremonies, and artistic expressions that reflect the spiritual and cultural beliefs of the Huna Tlingit. And on any visit to the park, you get to check out the park headquarters and see the tribal house that was built there in 2017-18. And it is just beautiful and tells a story of the local peoples. There are totem poles that are continuing to be built and put up that tell the story of the local clans that are in the area, that, you know, respect the peoples who are there, and talk about the changes that are taking place in Glacier Bay. There's deep connections to the place names for the Huna Tlingit. You know, many of the place names in Glacier Bay have origins in Tlingit, you know, reflecting the indigenous knowledge and the intimate understanding that they have of the landscape. These names often describe geographic features, landmarks, or significant events that hold significance culturally for the Huna Tlingit. It is their traditional territory. These were the people who were here first. They know everything about the park. You know, it is really an honor and privilege to be able to get to visit their homeland and to get to see these things. And something that I think is really special is the collaborative management that the Huna Tlingit have with the National Park Service. The Huna Tlingit actively participate in the management and stewardship of Glacier Bay National Park through collaborative partnerships with park authorities. Their traditional ecological knowledge and cultural perspectives are valued in the decision-making processes that relate to the conservation, resource management, and cultural heritage preservation in Glacier Bay National Park. And I believe it was the first kind of collaboration of its kind, not only in the United States, but on a global perspective, which is awesome. So the Tlingit were there first for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, before European explorers came in. But there is also a rich history of exploration in Glacier Bay National Park, starting with the voyage of George Vancouver back in 1794. Vancouver did a ton of mapping in not only the Pacific Northwest, but also in Alaska, as he led his ship from the British Royal Navy on this huge expedition. You know, during this journey, he explored and mapped the coast of what is now Alaska, including the Glacier Bay region, and it is marked as one of the earliest recorded European explorations of the area. Jump about a century, and we've got this guy called John Muir, who you may have heard of. And he was a naturalist and conservationist who visited Glacier Bay in 1879 during a scientific expedition to Alaska. He was inspired by the park's breathtaking scenery and majestic glaciers, and he documented all of those experiences in writing, which helped to popularize Glacier Bay as a destination for exploration and continued scientific study. Brought forward another 100 years, and we've got the National Geographic Society that sponsored several expeditions to Glacier Bay to study its glaciers, wildlife, and natural landscapes. These expeditions, which were led by renowned scientists and explorers at the time, contributed a ton of valuable scientific data and documentation to the area's geologic features and ecological diversity. And then fast forward to today, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, there have been loads of different surveying teams and government expeditions and Park Service expeditions that have been conducting, really detailed mapping and exploration efforts in Glacier Bay National Park, as well as its surrounding areas. These expeditions have aimed to chart the park's geography, document its natural resources, and facilitate research and conservation initiatives in Glacier Bay National Park. So it's a little bit of history about early exploration in the park. When we talk about getting there today, pardon me, I've got to back up a slide. There's a lot of different recreation access points in Glacier Bay National Park, not only commercially on a trip with Uncruise, but also for folks who are going to try and explore privately. One of the main ways of getting into Glacier Bay National Park, the dominant way of getting there, is on a boat. Glacier Bay is a really difficult place to access any other way. And so visitors to Glacier Bay generally experience the park's, stunning scenery and wildlife by taking a trip in there on a boat. The huge majority of visitors to Glacier Bay National Park are going in on very large cruise ships and are typically just going in, at 20 knots as fast as possible, getting up to a glacier, turning around, and coming back. But there's a lot of different and, in my opinion, better ways to see Glacier Bay National Park. If you are interested in going there yourself, there's a great way to get around, and it's via kayak. At the park headquarters, you can rent out a kayak. Kayaking is a super popular activity in Glacier Bay, which allows folks to paddle through the pristine waters and get close to glaciers, wildlife, and remote shorelines. You can take a guided trip or go out on your own. There's a few trails in the park, but they're mostly around the park's headquarters. And what I think is the best way to see Glacier Bay National Park is in the wilderness areas, in these remote backcountry locations where you get to be alone. You get to really feel how remote and far away from everything else you are. And on our trips, that's what it is. There's only one boat, and that's us at these places per day. And so you get to sit there and feel and smell and taste and listen to glaciers. And it's an experience that's hard to describe in words. It's hard to really tell you what that's like without really being there. But it is really impactful. And it's the way to see the park, in my opinion, is to get out there into the backcountry areas and explore the wilderness of Glacier Bay. It's just the stunning thing to get to see. And that leads me to land access in Glacier Bay National Park, which I think is key and crucial. Of all of the visitors that go into the park, less than 1% of people go on land. And when Dan founded this company, the ethic of what we do at Uncruise is we want to get you into these places, because at the end of the week, at the end of your trip, if we haven't left you feeling like you are connected to Alaska, connected to Glacier Bay National Park, like that you have an understanding and value of the place, we as expedition leaders and guides and as a company haven't done our job. And so we really focus on getting you right there, getting you to the place, getting you next to a glacier, getting you to touch the calved piece of ices that have come off the face of it, getting you to put glacial mud on your face and experience that and smell the intertidal. It's like 100% of folks who come on a trip with us have the opportunity to get on land if you're doing a trip in Glacier Bay National Park. And access is tough to get, but that's important that it's tough to get, because it leads not only us, but also other visitors to the park to have a really sustainable mindset towards land in the park. It is a wild place. It is a remote place. It is a place that does not belong to us, but rather to the wildlife and to the glaciers that inhabit Glacier Bay National Park. And so access is limited, but it's focused on sustainability. When we're there, we have very specific regulations that we follow in terms of group size on land. No more than 10, 11 people are going to be on a trip when you're going with a single group. You have to stay a quarter mile or a half mile away from anybody else when you're on land or at sea in certain parts of the park. And the goal of this is to provide you, as the person visiting Glacier Bay National Park, with the same feeling probably that John Muir had, with the same feeling that early explorers had, of being in a remote place, a wild place that is special and valuable all on your own. And that's just something we really strive for, because it makes that experience that much more special. When it comes to conservation efforts in Glacier Bay National Park, they are manyfold. There is ongoing glacial monitoring and research in Glacier Bay. The Park Service and its partners are actively involved in monitoring the park's glaciers to better understand their behavior, their responses to climate change, and their impact on the surrounding environments. Scientific research conducted by the park staff and the collaborating institutions provides really valuable data on glacial dynamics, on ice melt rates, landscape evolution, which inform in turn conservation strategies and management decisions. I've talked a little bit about the humpback whale in terms of the protection and conservation, but the park is super committed to protecting and preserving the diverse wildlife species and habitats that are found within its boundaries. Conservation efforts in the park focus on managing human and wildlife interactions, mitigating habitat fragmentation, and restoring degraded ecosystems. There are initiatives such as wildlife monitoring, habitat restoration projects, invasive species control. All these things help safeguard the park's ecological integrity and biodiversity for future generations. And then something important to us is the sustainable tourism practices. The park promotes and implements and requires sustainable tourism practices which minimize environmental impact and preserve the park's natural and cultural resources for future generations. There's visitor education programs when you're at the park headquarters. We follow leave no trace principles, not only in Glacier Bay National Park, but everywhere we go. And park regulations really aim to foster responsible behavior amongst visitors, and different infrastructure improvements and resource management initiatives aim to reduce the carbon footprint of vessels traveling through the park and enhance the park's resilience to climate change, which the park is an indicator of what's happening on a broader scale from climate change perspective. And one of the most special places that Uncruise kind of has unique access to is a place called the Glacier Bay Outback. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this map that you're seeing. So this is more or less a zoomed in picture of Glacier Bay National Park at Broad. So the thin green line that you're seeing is the national park boundaries. Again, it's a massive place spanning not only the Fairweather mountain range, Mount Fairweather, which is the tallest peak in Southeast Alaska, but also gets into the St. Elias Mountains, into the coastal range, and you can kind of see here the little blue lines moving through the middle. That's what we call Glacier Bay proper. So if you're doing a trip into Glacier Bay National Park and you've got Glacier Bay proper on your radar, at the northern terminus of the western arm of the western fjord that you're seeing there is Marjorie Glacier, it's Grand Pacific Glacier, it's Johns Hopkins Glacier, is Lamplugh Glacier, is Reed Glacier, places we get to go visit week in and week out. And every single trip that goes into Glacier Bay proper, whether it's a 1-day or a 2-day itinerary, we'll be visiting those glaciers, which is a really special opportunity. But some other place that we get to go that's sort of unique and hidden and tough to get to are areas we refer to as the Glacier Bay Outback. So the Glacier Bay Outback is Fern Harbor, which is near the Brady Glacier. It's down in the kind of southwestern corner of the park. Dundas Bay, this really beautiful riparian area that's sort of just east of Fern Harbor. And then in the last few years, we've been rediscovering this place called Excursion Inlet in Sawmill Bay, another area that has a really rich salmon stream running out of it, where we get the opportunity to see brown bears moving around in the meadows, whether that be in the spring, the summer, or the fall. And it's a wild, remote, rarely accessed place that we have access to because we've got these small, nimble little boats that can get you into these places in a way that other folks can't. So it's a special place to get to go visit. And our 2-day itineraries in the park often have 1 day in the proper part of the park and then 1 day in what we refer to as the Glacier Bay Outback, which is an equally wild, unique place to go visit. So I'm going to sort of conclude with the next few slides here, talking about the future of the park, because it is important to talk about. I've touched on this a little bit, but climate change has had a massive impact on Glacier Bay National Park. Warming weather globally has definitely shown its face in Glacier Bay National Park. We have not avoided it. Glacier Bay is not in this little microcosm of space that has been unaffected by climate change. It has certainly been affected. I have seen it. If every piece of ice in Glacier Bay melted tomorrow, the global ocean rise would go up about 4 inches for the whole world, which tells you a little bit about how much ice is in Glacier Bay National Park. And so the future of glaciers in Glacier Bay is important, not only on a local scale, but on a global scale. Preserving what we have there is important. And there's only one known glacier in Glacier Bay that's advancing. That's Johns Hopkins Glacier, but every other glacier in the park is in retreat currently. And it's a kind of tough thing to watch, if I'm being honest. It's been, I've been keenly aware of what's been happening up there just because I've seen it with my own eyes. And there's a ton of empirical data that just goes to show that glaciers there are losing steam and sort of disappearing, which is why it is so important to get up there while they are still there. Glacier National Park in Montana is almost, out of glaciers. I think they've got 10 years, they think, until the glaciers are gone. And that'd be a really sad thing to see in Glacier Bay National Park. We're not there yet, There's still time, there's still hope. The glaciers there are still strong and beautiful and huge and blue and stunning. And it's worth getting up there while you still can, because this park is a place that is valuable, not only because it's a national park, but just intrinsically for what it is. It is a place that has value. It is a place that has really keen importance to the Tlingit people, the Indigenous peoples whose homeland is there, to the wildlife that call the park home. And it is a place that is worth protecting and is worth going to visit for yourself, because it is just a place that, even though I've tried my best to give you a good picture of what Glacier Bay is, it's hard to really capture it without visiting. And so that's a little bit about the future of the park and what might be happening over the next few years. And if you're interested, we have a number of awesome trips. Again, I've only worked on boats that go to Glacier Bay because of how much I love it. We've got 1-day trips into the park that go into the main arm, into Glacier Bay proper. We've got 2-day trips that spend a time up in Glacier Bay proper, and then sometimes, another day in Glacier Bay proper in a little bay here and there, or out in the Glacier Bay outback. We get on land in the park. It's worth getting on land. You don't really get to experience Glacier Bay without going on land and seeing the glaciers and hearing the ice fall off and calve. We spend a ton of time there. Our average trip will spend 20 to 22 hours per day if you're doing a 1-day in the park, and 40 hours if you're doing a 2-day in the park, which is about 36 more hours than most folks get in Glacier Bay National Park. So the access that we have there is huge. It is key, and the reason that we focus on it so much is because of how important it is as a place, not only to Southeast Alaska, but again, globally. It's got so much value. So that is the end of my talk on Glacier Bay National Park. I like to finish with a Tlingit word. It's gunal chish. It means thank you for listening to my talk on Glacier Bay. This is the end of our series for March, and it's just been a real pleasure. If there are any questions from the gallery, Jimmy, you got anything for me? And if not, I'll bid you adieu.
There's no questions pending in the chat, but I do have one for you. Do you always, while you're in Glacier Bay National Park, what are the chances of seeing bears and humpback whales? Would you say that it's not always occasion, or would you see them every time you go in there?
One of those things, right? We don't control the wildlife, but we do generally know where to find them. And so in the park, I've had some of my most incredible interactions with brown bears specifically. There's a bear that for the last few years has been seen in the springtime at Lamplugh Glacier, walking in front of the glacier and flipping over boulders, looking through the intertidal. Brown bears are a very healthy population in Glacier Bay National Park, and so we frequently see them. I think probably every week we'll see a bear in the park, at least one. Same thing goes for mountain goats. It's the only place that I've seen them with any sort of consistency in Glacier Bay is in Glacier Bay, Gloomy Knob. And same thing goes for puffins. Pretty much see puffins every week that we're there. It's the only place I see puffins in the park, or is in the park. And then humpback whales, again, we don't watch them when we're in the park, but they're there and we see them as we go by. We just are prohibited, for a good reason, from whale watching within Glacier Bay National Park. I just saw something come through here. Ben was going to speak more about wolves. Yes, I was. Thank you. So I have a really unique perspective on this. One of my cousins is the lead researcher for Glacier Bay National Park on wolves. And wolves in the park are rare to see because they're skittish. They see us coming or hear us coming from miles away, and they kind of vacate the space. But Glacier Bay is the only place in Southeast Alaska that I have ever seen wolves. There's a few different packs in the park, and one of the most interesting things that we've gleaned from these packs in the park is that their diet has really shifted. The number one food for the wolves in Glacier Bay National Park is sea otters. As sea otters have had a massive rebound over the last 100 years when they were nearly extirpated from Russian fur hunters, they have rebounded back to all-time highs. And as a result, they've kind of eaten themselves a little bit out of house and home. And that's okay. The population is incredibly healthy. They're just going through kind of a natural curve of getting a little too populated, and they're now sort of steadying out. And so wolves are doing the cleanup work. So they are on land eating the dead and dying, essentially, sea otters that are just not able to sustain themselves because there's just too many sea otters at this point in time. And so, yeah, wolves in the park are it's a really unique opportunity to get to see a creature that's really reclusive and iconic and beautiful. I've seen them every year I've gone, but normally just once or twice in an entire year. So yeah, a little bit about wolves in the park.
And Ben, the questions are rolling in right now. We've got some really great ones. Before you attack the ones in the chat room, I have someone over in the Q&A asking why Johns Hopkins Glacier is growing and not receding.
Yeah, so it is not super well known, actually, why it's advancing. My personal take on it is that because it starts a little bit lower at elevation level, so as the ice sheet has lowered over time, the outflow for the area has still been maintained, if that makes sense. And so rather than feeding glaciers that started up higher, it's now still being fed since it starts a little bit lower. That's my take on Johns Hopkins. But the actual reason, I'm not super sure. It's not well studied. It's even though Glacier Bay is one of the preeminent areas to study glaciers, there's still not a ton of funding to study glaciers. And so while it's important to keep an eye on them and what's going on, there's still not a ton of research being done on glaciers. And so it's kind of a mystery. What else we got?
Let's see. We have, what is the program in case of bad weather?
There is no bad weather. There's only bad. That's what we like to say. If it's raining, we're going to get out there. If it's a little windy, we're going to get out there. We've got different ways that we can access different places, no matter the weather. I've been up there in every possible imaginable condition. And we just recommend that folks bring really good rain gear and wear your rubber boots, which we provide for you on the boat, and get after it. No bad weather, just bad gear.
I love that. It's an excellent answer. And Taylor wants to know, what are the chances of getting off the ship for an excursion via Zodiac or shoreland hiking on an itinerary that has a 1 day in Glacier Bay versus 2 days in Glacier Bay?
It's 100% no matter which. So if you're doing a 1 day, the 1 day itineraries in the park head up to Marjorie or Johns Hopkins Glacier, depending on the season and the access, for normally an early morning day. So like before breakfast, we'll be at the glacier like 6 in the morning, which is stunning. It's calm, it's peaceful. You get to go listen and watch this tidewater glacier and watch pieces of ice calve off of it with your morning coffee. And then while you're having breakfast at 7:30, the boat will reposition to either Lamplugh or Reed Glacier. And we will always do something on land, via kayak, via skiff, at those glaciers during that day. And so no matter what, 1 day or 2 day, you're still going to get access. What the 2 day itineraries in the park get is not only access to the glaciers that are up kind of in the northern terminus, but also to these really wild, remote places in the wilderness areas of Glacier Bay National Park that you wouldn't otherwise get to go see. There's a number of different spots that we hit. There's Bear Track Cove, there's North Sandy Cove, there's Fern Harbor, Dundas Bay, Sawmill Bay that we will hit on our 2nd day in the park, which gets you kind of unmatched access to places that otherwise you just don't get to visit. But we do spend 1 day up at the glaciers, no matter what. If you're doing a 1 day or a 2 day, you will get guaranteed access to get on land if you want to.
Nice. And people are super intrigued with the idea of the outback in Glacier Bay because it's so unique. What itineraries go into the outback?
Yeah, we've got the Northern Passages itinerary that goes from Juneau to Sitka. And that sometimes we've got 2 days on those. Sometimes we've got 1 day on those that will hit the park. Wild Woolly and Wow itineraries will get to visit the outback. Our Juneau to Juneau loop. Same thing with the Glacier Bay Adventure on the Wilderness Discoverer that also does 2 days in Glacier Bay National Park and has the options and opportunities to go visit the Glacier Bay outback.
That is awesome. Thank you so much. We've been getting, I'm sure after I start talking here, you're going to see all the great comments we've been getting on Glacier Bay. I felt like I knew Glacier Bay until I heard your presentation. Thank you so, so much. It's a mystery, and I'm sure we could spend a lifetime just learning about this beautiful area.